Namaskar, and welcome to the second edition of our podcast series, India Growth Dialogues. C-DEP hosts this series so that it enables us to sit down with the top names, experts, academics, and senior bureaucrats to discuss issues of importance to us and the country. And today we are greatly honored and privileged to have Professor Abhijit Das with us. Professor Das is a big name, a great renowned expert on international trade policies and on WTO. He has been a faculty of IIFT, the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, where he also headed the Center for WTO Studies. And today he joins us to discuss protecting Atmanirbhar through trade remedies. So, welcome, Professor Das. It's a great honor to host you here. We all know a little bit about trade remedies, that anti-dumping duties, countervailing duties, as also safeguards. Now, for the benefit of viewers, would you like to explain why these instruments, trade remedies, are so important, and particularly in context of India?
Thank you, Ruben, and thank you to C-DEP for organizing this podcast and inviting me to participate in it. I deem it a matter of considerable privilege and honor to share some thoughts on trade remedies. Many of you would be aware that the World Trade Organization as an institution really seeks to promote trade liberalization, but in parallel, it also has very important provisions which provide a reassurance to countries that if they face a situation of either dumped imports or subsidized imports, they will have the policy instrument to impose offsetting duties so that their domestic producers are not adversely affected by these unfair trade practices. In addition, the WTO provisions also provide a safety valve to importing countries, whereby if there is a surge in imports of a particular product, the importing country can impose what is called a safeguard duty. Let's bear in mind that these three policy instruments, anti-dumping duty, which is aimed at countering dumping, countervailing duty, which is aimed at countering subsidized imports, as well as safeguard duty, which is aimed at countering import surges, are collectively called trade remedial measures or trade remedy instruments. Why they are important? The first two instruments seek to address unfair trade practice. In other words, the domestic producers of the importing country must not get adversely affected by practices of dumping indulged in by the exporter or the practices of subsidization by the government of the exporting country. Now, the WTO agreements have very detailed provisions which determine when can an anti-dumping duty be imposed, when can a countervailing duty be imposed, when can a safeguard duty be imposed. These provisions are really quite onerous, very complex, at times really difficult to understand. But for a country like India, we have managed to surmount these challenges, and we have instituted a mechanism whereby the government is able to legitimately protect the domestic producers both from unfair trade practices of dumping and subsidization, as well as from import surges. So, in a nutshell, the trade remedial measures are a very potent policy instrument to make sure that domestic producers do not suffer on account of unfair trade practice or import surges.
Great. And how significant in the current context vis-a-vis India, how significant are the provisions of these instruments of trade remedies for India?
For India, the instruments of trade remedies are very, very important. Let's bear in mind two or three dimensions. Indian economy is fairly diverse when it comes to manufacturing sector. The contribution of manufacturing in national income or domestic value added is not very high as it should have been. So it's really important that if the manufacturing sector feels a threat or is actually facing what is called injury on account of subsidized imports or dumped imports or import surges, then the government can invoke these policy instruments, can undertake the underlying investigation, and if the requirements are satisfied, then the government secures a right to impose these trade remedial duties. Of course, it's up to the government thereafter to decide whether to import these duties or not. In the present context, when we are seeing one of our neighbors indulging in dumping over past so many years, for India to legitimately protect its domestic industry, it is absolutely important that the government uses these policy instruments to make sure that initiatives like Atmanirbhar Bharat do not get undermined by unfair trade practice. Having said that, when it comes to the agricultural sector, we are yet to see any of the trade remedial measures being successfully invoked by India. Yes, India did initiate some investigations on some agricultural products in the past, but these could not result in imposition of the trade remedial duties. Now, the reason is not very far to seek. All these three instruments require the investigating authority to establish either injury to the domestic producers or threat of injury to the domestic producers. Who are domestic producers? There is a very clear definition provided in these agreements. In a nutshell, when it comes to agricultural products, given the very large number of farmers involved, it's humanly impossible to have data which will establish injury in the context of agricultural products. So that's an area where India has so far not invoked successfully these trade remedial measures. But when it comes to industrial products, India is, literally speaking, the leading user of these policies. And to give you an illustration, when it comes to anti-dumping duty, from day one in 1995 till about a few months ago, India would have imposed close to 750 anti-dumping measures. The second user, United States, would have imposed about 625 anti-dumping measures. The third user, that is European Union, is far, far behind, about 325 measures. So US and India are the largest user of anti-dumping instrument, with India ranking a bit higher than US. And why is that? For a very simple reason that Indian market is big, growing. We have a fairly diversified manufacturing sector, and that gives the temptation to the foreign exporters to indulge in unfair trade practice, try to capture the domestic market in India, and that is where the role of the government comes in to counter these unfair trade practices.
Please try and help me to understand, if I'm not mistaken, what you just said, that India has been using this instrument to a great extent, but at the same time, it's been a kind of a mixed bag. Like in certain sectors, we are doing well. In certain other areas, like agriculture, we have not done well. So is it because we lack teeth, or uh, we are kind of like there is a kind of lack in will, or what is it? Like it's a mixed bag, right?
It's a mixed bag. The reason why we have not been successful in invoking these measures for agriculture goes back to the provisions of the agreement as well as our own agricultural system, where we literally have hundreds of thousands of farmers. Now, how do you collect data in respect of let us say, sales, prices, inventory, profits, wages, when it comes to literally hundreds and thousands of farmers? Just cannot do it. So it's not a question of will. It's really a question of how the provisions of the agreements have been framed and the nature of Indian agriculture. On the other hand, some of the advanced countries where agriculture is really not so fragmented, where they have huge farms, they have succeeded in invoking some of these trade remedial measures for agricultural products. The reason, again, is simple. They do not have so many farmers from whom data has to be collected. Whereas in India, we are hopelessly challenged. We just cannot put in place a system where, in respect of hundreds and thousands of farmers, we'll be able to gather the data to establish injury to, to them.
Well taken point. Tell me, we have a situation, we are told that Indian domestic industry has really become self-sufficient. It's self-reliant. It's very competitive. Its standards are very, very high. Yet, we are given to understand that it's suffering from the adverse impact of imports. So, where do we strike a balance, like free trade vis-a-vis protecting our own industry, which otherwise is, I believe, is very competitive?
I have a slightly different perspective over here. If we look at global trends, if we look at uh, our export volumes and the export value, what we do find is that, subject to a few exceptions, in most of the sectors, we might not be competent. And the reason is not far to seek. Our infrastructure, electricity, roads, logistics, they may be good, but when you compare it with some of our peers with whom we face competition in the national market, then we are lagging behind. And this is what adds to the cost of manufacturing in the country. And that is what makes the domestically manufactured goods lose price competitiveness.
So, does it imply that the domestic industry needs a helping hand in terms of these instruments, trade remedies?
We need to be slightly cautious over here. The domestic industry certainly needs a helping hand, no doubt about it. But that helping hand cannot remain the crutch for the domestic industry till eternity. The domestic industry has to enhance its competitiveness. And here the government has a very important role to play. Some of the recent initiatives for improving our infrastructure, logistics, these will bear fruit in a few years. And that is when we will see our price competitiveness of our domestic production in many sectors enhancing. Our financial strength in these sectors will certainly improve. And that will be the time when we can truly say that, yes, in these large number of sectors, India is genuinely price competitive. But till that happens, some sort of a support from the government will be required. But that support, as I said earlier, has to be a bit nuanced. The industry itself also has to take steps to enhance its price competitiveness.
So, it will be kind of a balancing act, right?
Absolutely
Like,
correct.
it should be nuanced and balanced. But it will still be, these instruments are very, very critical for our industries to flourish. Right?
Definitely, if we look at a advanced economy like United States or even the European Union, they resort to these policy instruments. And these policy instruments are there for good reasons. Because large markets, there will be a tendency of the exporter to dump, or of the exporting government to subsidize their exports to get an edge in the market. Now, to counter these unfair trade practices, these trade remedial instruments will remain relevant.
And particularly for India, because it's a favorite destination for many countries for dumping.
Absolutely, it's an important destination for many exporters to dump their products, or for governments to sell, to subsidize their production, and these subsidized products come into the country. So, and that gets reflected in the numbers. As I mentioned, India is by far the largest user of anti-dumping, and US is about 100 odd measures behind India. So now I don't take that as a badge of honor, but that illustrates the fact that India has to be cautious about the unfair trade practices indulged in by its trading partners.
So we can't possibly be overdoing these instruments, but at the same time, it's also very necessary that we resort to these uh, instruments, right?
You've put it very aptly, Rubinda. We cannot be overusing instruments. These instruments have to be used judiciously. And why do I say that? Very simple. If we are importing some parts and components and these are dumped or subsidized and we impose anti-dumping or countervailing duty, then that increases the price for the downstream user, which in turn will increase the price for the consumer. And in a way, that certainly will result in a reduction of overall welfare. But having said that, one cannot just think in terms of the interest of downstream users. One also has to think in terms of the employment generated by the product which is facing dumping or subsidized imports. So a balance needs to be struck by the government. And one way of striking the balance could be that look at what is the employment generated by the sector which is facing problems of dumping, subsidization, or import surges. Also, look at the employment generated by the downstream users of that industrial product. And maybe some sort of a balancing act can be done. To give you an illustration, this balancing act is very clearly laid down in the Agreement on Safeguards, whereunder the governments have to, in a way, demonstrate how imposing the safeguard duty is in public interest. So that seeks to balance the interests of the domestic producers and the downstream consumers of that product. Whereas in the anti dumping duty or the case of countervailing duty, there is no mandatory requirement to take public interest into consideration. However, having said that, there are provisions in both these agreements which require the investigating authority to give interested parties, including downstream industrial users of the product which is subject to the investigation, to be heard as part of the investigation process. And to take this argument further, in India, we have a two-tier system in a way, whereby in present days, the investigation is undertaken by Directorate General of Trade
Trade remedies.
Remedies, DGTR. They examine whether dumping has taken place, subsidization has taken place, or surge in imports has taken place, and is there a consequent injury to the domestic producers. If their finding is affirmative, then the DGTR recommends the duty, and this recommendation goes to the Department of Revenue. Now, the Department of Revenue is expected to take a more holistic view of the entire matter, and the Department of Revenue, after taking a holistic view, then decides whether to impose the duty or not. So, at the level of Department of Revenue, the way our system works, it could be said that yes, some consideration of larger public interest does get injected into our trade remedial mechanism. And as a consequence, there have been instances in some of our earlier years of anti dumping investigations when the government DGTR recommended the duties, for example, in respect of newsprint, but the Department of Revenue did not apply the duties, did not enforce the duties. Similarly, in the case of metallurgical coke, initially the duty was enforced, but once the country started facing a shortage of metallurgical grade coke, the duties were removed in public interest. So public interest becomes an important instrument, but it cannot be overdone.
You bring me to a great point because you just mentioned public interest. And I find ever since I've studied this, been studying this trade remedies, that there are a lot of there is a larger debate around it, saying that it's nothing but protectionism. Like there's a kind of, you may call it misunderstanding or misconception. And then there is also this line of argument which says that uh, this kind of these instruments generally result in adverse impact on downstream and causes price rise. So why should, it's not in public interest. So it's not black and white, as you're saying, right?
Absolutely correct. It's not black and white. It's these instruments definitely result in an enhancement in prices for the downstream industry. But having said that,
But there is a larger good.
there's a larger good, which is to protect the domestic producers from unfair trade practices indulged in by our trading partners, or to protect them from surge in imports.
And because we are helping the local industry, the domestic industry, so which means we protect employment and the general economic well-being of this country. Am I right?
Absolutely correct. But having said that, there are instances where many analysts are of the opinion that maybe in a few cases our anti-dumping action uh, might have been overdone in terms of
So a
duration of measure.
case of few bad apples.
Could be a case of few bad apples. But the short point is we cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater just because there are a few bad illustrations, bad examples where maybe we overdid in terms of the trade remedial measures.
But by and large, these instruments are helpful for the country
I have
if used judiciously.
absolutely correct. You've hit the nail on the head. Judicious use of these policy instruments is the key to protecting the domestic industry from unfair trade practice, but at the same time, making sure that the downstream producers are not greatly disadvantaged on account of resort by the country to these trade remedial instruments.
And off late, and uh, that's kind of grabbed our attention. Like off late, like as you say, that India has been using trade remedies, maybe even more than United States. But at the same time, off late in the recent 2 years, like between 1990 and 2000, apparently, like almost everything that DGTR recommended was accepted, and anti-dumping duties were imposed. But post 2020, it's kind of just been turned on its head. Now, almost everything is being rejected. Why this? What explains this?
Before I come to the explanation, I think some statistics will be highly relevant here. During January to December 2019, the Department of Revenue accepted the findings of DGTR and imposed anti-dumping duties in all the 13 cases in which the duties had been recommended. But the picture changes dramatically a couple of years down the line. During January to December 2022, Department of Revenue accepted the recommendations of DGTR only in 7 cases, whereas it rejected the recommendations in 29 cases. So this should make it very clear to us that there has been a dramatic reversal in trend, whereby earlier, almost in all cases, the recommendations of DGTR were being accepted by Department of Revenue. Now it is much less. Now the rejection is much more as compared to the acceptance. Why has this happened? I have no definitive answer. I tried to examine some of the findings. It's not that dumping is not happening. In all these 29 cases where the DGTR recommended the anti-dumping duties, there was very clear evidence of dumping taking place. There was very clear evidence of the domestic producers having suffered injury on account of the dumped imports. So it cannot be the case that the incidence of dumping has declined. No, that's just not possible.
So what has changed?
It could be argued that maybe a Department of Revenue is cognizant of the fact that these trade remedial instruments enhance the cost for the downstream consumers, and hence it is reticent, reluctant to imposing anti-dumping duties. Again, that doesn't get borne out by facts. I mentioned in 7 cases the Department of Revenue did impose anti-dumping duty. If you look at some of these products, for example, stainless steel pipes, etc., or pipes and tubes, or galvanized, electro-galvanized steel, these were products on which anti-dumping duties were imposed, and these are also used by downstream producers. So the argument that imposing anti-dumping duties raises costs for downstream producers, hence let's withdraw our hand and not impose anti-dumping duty, may not be correct. So I really am puzzled as to what is happening, why there is such a mismatch between what the DGTR says and what the Department of Revenue is doing. And this is not a case by case situation. Clearly, in such a large number of investigations, if there is a mismatch between two arms of the government, it illustrates that there is a fundamental systemic problem. And when such fundamental systemic problems arise, it's really incumbent on the cabinet secretary to call the two arms of the government, in this case, the Department of Commerce, under which the DGTR functions, as well as the Department of Revenue, and try to sort out the matter. I think if we are unable to do that, then we will be failing in protecting our domestic producers from unfair trade practice, which in turn will end up undermining some of our laudable initiatives like Atmanirbhar Bharat.
So right now we are in a peculiar situation, in simple terms, like where one arm, the right hand is disposing of what the left arm is suggesting, right, recommending.
In a way, you've put it quite succinctly. So it should be incumbent on both parts of the government. For example, for the Department of Revenue, when it rejects the recommendations of DGTR, to give a reasoned explanation why it is in public interest to reject imposition of anti-dumping duty. And the DGTR in turn, particularly for anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases, it should give more reasons why it's in public interest to impose these duties. Now, we have been seeing in a couple of recent cases that the DGTR has really strengthened its practice on this aspect. So, hopefully, we might see a slightly reversal of this trend in coming few months. Let's keep our fingers crossed.
But
on
as
that.
of now, it's somewhat inexplicable. We are still yet to figure out what resulted in this change, right?
You're very correct, Rubinda. It is absolutely inexplicable, and people are puzzled world over.
We have a question from a viewer. How exactly does the Indian government determine the necessity and degree of trade remedies for different sectors?
Okay. Now, the investigation process, let's take the illustration of anti-dumping. There, the government has to determine dumping. Rules are laid out as to what is dumping. Very complicated rules, but in a nutshell, what is required to be done is to compare the export price in the Indian market with the price of the same product sold in the domestic market of the exporter. Now, if the price in the Indian market is lower than the domestic price in the home country, then there is dumping. And the extent of dumping is really, in a way, a guide towards the amount of duty that can be imposed. So the rules are very clearly laid down as to determine whether dumping exists, what is the degree of dumping, and the extent of the duty.
And who dumps the most in India?
As in most other countries, it's not difficult to guess it's China. But having said that, many other Asian countries are not far behind.
So, to go back to the topic of our discussion, like protecting Atmanirbhar through trade remedies, what needs to be done? Like we have covered a lot of ground, and thanks for helping us in explaining things. What needs to be done to protecting Atmanirbhar? through these instruments?
What we need to do are two things. At this juncture, this disconnect between what the DGTR says and what the Department of Revenue does, this disconnect needs to be addressed head on, preferably by the Cabinet Secretary, and in parallel, a judicious use of this. We have to protect our domestic producers from unfair trade practices or from surge in imports. But at the same time, we have to be cognizant that this has a cost for the downstream producers as well. So a fine balancing act needs to be done.
So to sum it up, it's been a great conversation with you. But to sum it up, judicious use of trade remedies, absolutely essential, but a fine balancing act. That is what India needs to adopt, right?
You've summarized it so well, Ruben, that I couldn't have done a better job of summarizing it.
Thank you. It was great talking to you and a pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
Thanks a lot. It was my honor.
Thank you.
Thank you.